carry on talking from my last lecture where I talked about truth as one and many, or as absolute and as having almost infinite number of aspects to it, so that we can simultaneously dispel two very bad ideas, and that is that one of them is that there's that any truth that is articulated by a group that is objectively demonstrable is somehow inviolate, that stands there forever. And the problem with that is that any information that we have, any claims that we make on the basis of information we have, are really there because of the question that we've posed and the information that we've had available to us in answering that question. But a slight changing of the shade of the question can very often lead us to reconsider and re-examine information. So that's why very often truth claims are like buildings, and one question may, what is it, a joist, when you take out a joist and everything, it holds things together, and if you take that out, the whole building will collapse. And it's simply because what you've got is the associational arrangement, which is hierarchical as well as extensive. So its extension and its vertical nature is such that horizontal and vertical nature and its general structure is really dependent upon the way everything fits everything else within that, which is what the idealists with their coherence theory of truth were on about. But of course, what you're also trying to make a claim about is the world as such, not just a way we put our information about the world together. And the world as such can reveal, or some interaction, because we are information generating creatures as well as information absorbing creatures. That's going to be very important to the things I want to talk about today, or for the things I want to talk about today. So one right question can bring down a whole edifice of supposed knowledge. And one of the ways that we as a species have gathered knowledge is to have specialists seeking ever more into certain minutiae of claims, information, processes, and at the same time the area, not just the specialists themselves, but the specialists contribute to a certain discipline, an area of knowledge. But again, the problem is that some other information which may have been disclosed, uncovered, generated, because it can be all of that, over here in another compartment has not been considered by people in this compartment. But once you consider that information, then there may be stuff that you're working on over here that loses luster, so to speak, or will come crashing down to the ground. Or another way of saying that is you find the limitations of its applicability, the limitations of its deployment, in a sense the limitations of the kind of truth it is, which opens us up to the fact that truth and error are dialectically related. And this is what is going to interest me today. And the backdrop to this talk today is the very disturbing distinction that is being made between information and misinformation and the way that is being deployed for political purposes. So I'm going to get to that because I do think it's very much related to the nature of truth, and I think that we are living in a time where the ambition of those with political, technocratic aspirations are so convinced of their own certainties, their right to be leaders, global leaders, and that we should follow them, and that means we should accept their ability, their knowledge, the associations that they have, the disciplines that they engage with, the blocks of solidarity that they form, And part of it is a kind of political dependency that they are creating. And this, I think, is incredibly dangerous. So, given that I am talking about the more knowledge-based aspects of this, I do want to say something a little more, something that I've been hinting at all throughout the lectures, or the talks, and that is that there are many people out there who are very critically observant about the way the world is happening now, and they are often just put in the crazy basket because they investigate areas which aren't part of the mainstream way of thinking or the mainstream media, and they're certainly not part of mainstream academic thinking. They're not part of any kind of curricula. And yet, some of these people are very, very smart and are very thorough. And so I'll mention a few people whose work I am familiar with to greater or less extent. One of them is Whitney Webb, young woman, very brilliant, who's written a very large work called Nation Under Blackmail. And it's, on the surface, it's about Jeffrey Epstein, but it is really about the way organised crime and sexual blackmail and state operatives and state operations have become enmeshed in each other, and that Jeffrey Epstein is kind of a cipher for that. You start looking at him, but then that leads out to all these other aspects or trails, and the different aspects of the Jeffrey Epstein case, these different trails of participation, information, engagements, encounters is the word I'm looking for, encounters that have occurred between different people. Now, that's one. Another one is Richard Grove. Richard Grove is very interesting. He does a show called Grand Theft World. And the fascinating thing about Richard Grove is that he should have been at a meeting in one of the Twin Towers on 9/11. And he has raised all sorts of issues about the financial trails that are part of the story of what happened on 9/11. Now, most people don't know that story. Most people dismiss it. He can easily be dismissed as a conspiracy theory, except the information that he has, because of his personal circumstance and his life journey, is very interesting. And I defy anyone to simply dismiss this guy as an uneducated idiot. Another one is James Corbett, the Corbett Report. He too is caught up, interested in what occurred on September 11, 2001. Now, this has not been a major area of interest of mine, but I have come across them, and I think they've asked very, very interesting questions. There's so much happening in the world. There's a certain reportage upon it, but there's other things that are happening. For whatever reason, the reportage on it is barely taking place, and those doing the reporting on it can be deplatformed or attacked or criticised as stupid people. Conspiracy theorists is the term that is used to close people down. And what they're doing, on the one hand, is a long way away from what I'm doing in these course of lectures. So much so, you might think, if you're interested in those people, well, why would I bother, watching something about philosophy? I don't need to learn anything more about philosophy. And that is a reasonable position, given how critical I am of so much philosophy. But I would say the handy aspect about philosophy is, as you're trying to understand stuff, there are better ways and worse ways to organise the information that is available to you. Now, the problem with an ideologue, which I've indicated before, is that they have already set the parameters of what is tolerable and the underlying principles which are unassailable, and they never dig into those underlying principles. So, for example, if you're a Marxist, you need the labour theory of value. Marx knew that. You have to have the labour theory of value. But if you go digging around in the labour theory of value and you find, well, that's no good, the whole edifice will fall. So if you're a believer in that, you have no interest in digging away at that edifice. And all ideologies, in a sense, are philosophical inventions. And I think I did say this before, but it is worth repeating. And that is that the age of ideology, which we consider a 19th century phenomenon moving into the 20th century, and in the Second World War is the big play out between the major ideologies and its aftermath, but even leading into that, but the ideologies themselves are all brewing. Fascism is belated, that is, it comes out of the First World War, but socialism, liberalism, conservatism, they all come out of the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, beginning, say around the French Revolution they're starting to form, but by the 19th century they're very ensconced. But they're all based upon ranges, associations of ideas, and they all are programmatic, and they are all directing information. If you like, they're ways of making information flows, channeling it, and being bound up with what appeals to you. Remember me saying about the analytic philosophers, they want an absolute truth, but something appeals to them. Well, an ideology has a built-in appeal. It's like triggering something in you that goes, yeah, that's the really important thing. And I'm committed to that. And I'm committed to others that think like that. And therefore, the truths that are disclosed through our engagement in reality, our solidarity, the bonds that we have, how we talk to each other, how we appraise circumstances, that gives us a position. So it's a kind of positionality. Now, all truth, all information access involves positionality. And by positionality, there's a number of ways of looking at that. One way, as a very important way, and if you forget this way, then you're going to miss a lot of things, and that is the way of the division of labour. And again, I may have said this, but it's very unfortunate what the Marxists did with this fundamental notion of political economy, because they ultimately concealed something to themselves. They concealed it from themselves to themselves, and it's in keeping with a program that is so limited and indeed deeply erroneous at some levels. And let me say, I think all ideologies are going to have a fracture point. So this is not, therefore trust my ideology. No, this is a way to try and get you, if you want to think more philosophically, more deeply, than simply knowing about the particular machinations of our time, which are so disturbing, and I can see why one gets caught up in them, and indeed too many people don't know about them. But but there is a longer game plan, if you like, which philosophy is really about how to think about things in the very long run, over time, trying to discover or uncover ways of processing information, assaying it, grouping it, which will endure. That's the value of philosophy. The problem with it is very often that it's making wrong moves, or it commits too early, or it hasn't quite got the questions right. Okay, and then schools form, and then they all battle each other out, because I come back to positionality. Positionality, I said, I gave the example of the division of labour. So the division of labour, whatever aspect of the productive process you're participating in, leads you to have to work with certain kind of information, have to relate to other people in a certain way with narratives involved. So it does come with a kind of associational framework which some people want to call ideology. Now, I said with the Marxists, the thing I think was unforgivable is by reducing everything to proletariat and capital, they left out what I think is a critical component of the division of labour that really has bearing on what is transpiring today and is very much connected to this information versus misinformation dyad that's been increasingly established in relatively recent times. And that is that the professional classes don't really figure in this. This is why the writings of Max Weber, who... It's not like he wrote this huge theoretical tome explaining the theory. It's actually quite small, the amount where he says this, but he uses this. And he has a view of class in which status and consciousness matters, and that's true, but it's a way of breaking up beyond the class space as Marx understood it. In fact, in the case of Marx, he did recognise all these other subclasses, but because he presented the problem and the play out as this great big Manichaean historical processes of good and evil, even though he doesn't want to use that moral language, but ultimately the good will be, it's a religious story, the good will be, the world has been saved because of the unification established by the proletariat, the industrial working class, and they will all do good to each other and with each other because why wouldn't they? They've got rid of the evil in the world, which is capitalist. I mean, honestly, that intellectual, that people who read and write books can believe this, that's just so crazy. And to me, it's an indication of what ideological thinking does. It closes down a questioning part of the mind, and it usually, what fills that up is a sense of moral self-certainty, something that really, infuriates people who hear something that's contrary to the story. And there's so many ways now, we're way beyond anything that Marx had wanted or envisaged in the kind of ideological conflagrations that are out there right now, and the kind of things that bond people, that get people angry together, and the kind of contradictory alliances which are very much part and parcel of the reality that we're living in. So, division of labour is one positionality. Your time is another. Your time and circumstance in history is another. Your culture is another. Your social role, again, in our time, the onslaught, the attack upon social roles has been huge, especially with the feminist movement, attacking the traditional role of women, and how that has played out has been quite fascinating. Because on the one hand, some of the aspects of some of the things they were doing, given the division of labour, given the new transformations that were taking place socially, are very understandable. But others were very big, abstract claims. You'll remember me saying in an earlier lecture, abstraction is often distraction. So very often what we would have is people say, all of history was like this. It was all about the oppression of this group. And in my talk about emancipation, I was drawing attention to the fact that the idea of putting everything, seeing the whole world as one in which there's emancipation versus oppression, it's just fantastical. It's based upon an abstraction, and it distracts from the very important gains that we have made over time through the different developments, the different experiments, very often unintended experiments, but the different things that we've been doing, and how in our excavations on the different fronts of reality, because reality is full of all these different fronts, and that's what a role is. A social role, is a way of activating your powers and potential in terms of the direction that is part and parcel of you performing a certain set of tasks, operations, beholden to a certain set of duties, and what comes out of the cultivation of the self and selves in that context. The idea that you can just disrupt social roles without massive consequences of completely unintended and unknown types, because you were 25 years old or something, or 30 years old, and you become a professor and you know how to fix up the world, and you've reduced everything to a principle or a dyad principle. This is quite astonishing, because as you start to unravel social roles, a whole lot of new ways of being are opened up, but you wouldn't have any idea of the nature of that being that is being opened up, because you haven't lived it. All you've done is had a little picture in your mind of what you want it to be like. But what you want to be like, and what you make with your life, what you make in the world, what we make of the world, there's no connection. Perfect example. All this talk about peace in the United States and the developed countries, and here we are in a war being supplied by Western countries with one of the partners in that war. Which side you want doesn't matter, but they're not. It's just a complete fantasy mismatch between this talk of what would give you that and what actually is going on and what is actually happening. And this is the same with all the talk about emancipation. All this talk of emancipation, well, yeah, sure, some people are happier in some ways about some things, but other people are far less happy and far more miserable. And to just see emancipation as a problemless concept, or oppression as simply a catch-all phrase that you can throw around any way you want, is a complete failure to understand something I've said before, is all societies are based around constrainment, containment, sacrifice, obligations, doing all sorts of things you don't want to do, and usually that's more in traditional societies. That's because that's the way it's worked for so long, and you know what you're dealing with. It may not be the best, in fact it may be shit, but what you don't know, what you do know is you've got this, but over there is a great unknown, and that could be disaster and chaos, which is what we partly face now. Now, I said positionality really matters. I said that the professional classes play a huge role today in terms of, especially those dealing in ideas. So the ideas, what I call the ideas making and brokering classes, they sift between different ideas to get the ones that they are able to process, and that's very important. They're just people, they're processing information, and it's the information that suits their idea of the way the world should be, on the basis of the information that they have, and also on the basis of their positionality within the wider spectrum of the division of labour. Now, that's also is going to vary depending upon social circumstance, cultural circumstance. So, if you're at a university in Egypt, I'm guaranteeing you that you won't think that doing queer studies is going to be a way to advance your career, nor in Pakistan. You know that. You're not going to do that, even if you may have some sympathy for that. But if you're... I'll give you another example, given I've started with Islamic or Muslim people. If you're in the United States, you can have a good career in a university if you're Muslim, but you don't want to buck the trend about queer studies or feminist, even though privately with other family members and certain other friends you may not want to go into that because they would think that was pretty wretched. Now, this is not being either Islamic phobic or simplistic. This is really just paying attention to the different circumstances, the pulls and pushes of group dynamics and consensuses that operate, if you like, the narratives that function in different institutional settings and amongst different professions. So that's again, that is an aspect of the agreements or the priorities that are established, that are part and parcel of a collective consensus about what information should be gathered, what should be done with it, who will benefit. And this is where, as I said, the professional classes play an incredibly important role. And bear in mind too that it's only, and I may have said this, but it's only really with the French Revolution, you might want to say kind of the American Revolution, but that's a bit different, but certainly with the French Revolution, the artisans and the professions, professional classes, that's where we see lawyers really entrenching themselves in the political system, because what you've basically done is you've replaced a way of coordinating loyalty and group obligation, groups following orders, that was based upon military valour and military just strength, and that's been slowly pushed over to the sides as verbal dexterity takes over. So, that's what a parliament is a talking place, and in that talking you're hoping to broker between the different interests. And this was in a sense this was a reflection of the changing social circumstances, class circumstances, changes in the division of labour, something that Marx was kind of onto about the different technologies and techniques, changing what he calls the mode of production, changing how work is operating, and how this in turn would change the politics of the time. Again, he saw that as the ideological surface of the underlying economic processes. There's an important degree of truth in that. So once you've got a society like that, and as the impact of that revolution and the circumstances, and then there was a reaction to it, but ultimately within 120 years, it's all changed drastically. But it doesn't just change in one way, because you've got fascism, you've got communism, and you've got liberal democracy all coming out of the ideas that are being spawned by the French Revolution, and coming out of the elite consensus and the new elite, which is exactly what it was. It was an elite replacement done in the name of the people. But the people as such, in fact, if you look at the French Revolution, they're very regional where the support was, and there was a lot of reasons why certain groups didn't want that change. In the Vendée, for example, they did not want that change. They were very loyal to their older way of being in the world. They were very loyal to their Catholic faith. They were very loyal to their political rulers, because that had a symbiotic relationship for them that worked. They identified with that. Whereas in Paris, they had a whole other set of expectations, priorities, desires, things they were pushing for, and that meant they had to go and kill these people in the Vendée who didn't want to be, told what to do by them. So that's, in a sense, what you see is who's right here? Well, you can't really distinguish between information of the sort that is meaningful to you, what matters to you, what you value, from information value, etc. The only way you can do that is move into abstraction, and so then you have certain people, and this is often what philosophy is, because, as I said, philosophy is something that simultaneously enables us to question things more, but it can also be a way of closing up a certain tapestry of associations and fitting it into some ideological framework. So there is, as Karl Marx rightly said, there is a connection between social being and consciousness, and social being precedes consciousness. Or that's a pretty sloppy way, and I think he's quite sloppy in how he does it, but it's also because he leaves himself out of the picture. he is not a member of the working class, and yet he's claiming to have a consciousness of what would be the great mode of deliverance from oppression of the working class, but he's not of them. But insofar as our positionality does lead us into certain common patterns of association through our common endeavours that are based upon that particular access point of the real, generative point of the real, that needs to be borne in mind. But that doesn't mean that information may not flow to you from other sources, and it also means that we participate on multiple fronts of reality. We're not just a worker, or if you're a mother, you're not just a mother. If you're a sister, you're not just a sister. We have multiple roles, and to make our society be able to function, somehow we have to be able to galvanise, and that's one of the reasons the West is in such trouble, is because there is really very little galvanising of spontaneous cooperative endeavour that is not increasingly being dictated to by the state and by corporations and by the various interests groups and aspirants for power, including just economic power, but authority within these different institutions. And this is a serious, very, very serious problem of a sort, in its way, every bit as bad as any kind of animosity between different warlords would have been in a more feudal style of system. And how we are witnessing this play out is quite shocking, really, because what we're seeing is a degree of anger and wrath within nations now of a sort that's quite, very shocking. I won't say it's unprecedented, but it's very shocking. So much of this anger has come from different interests focusing upon different aspects and coming up with different solutions to how they would make the world fit their interest more. And as I've indicated, that interest is often economic interest. So, for example, the populist movements, whether in Europe or the United States or even to some extent in Australia, they tend to be much closer to working class, or much more filled with working class people, because they and especially the unskilled, they don't really, and those that also have more traditional sense of family, for whatever reason they may have this, it might be religious convictions or something like that, but they are tending to identify more with a way of piecing the world together that fits the reproduction of a certain set of roles and narratives that they were exposed to, they grew up with, and indeed navigating their way through life on the basis of those choices they see as intrinsic to their own freedom. So one of the big catch cries amongst popular movements is the argument that the world that is being made is increasingly totalitarian. Now, the other side, now you can see the way I'm putting this is there's a major cleavage, but as we focus more upon the major cleavages and the positions, we start to see a way in which various even contradictory groups dovetail and become part and parcel of the same support structure, the same support base that informs a certain kind of information, often ideologically infected information, but I've already, I think, said enough to indicate that there's something, ideology can be a term that we use for a kind of patterned group of associations. But usually when we use that term ideology, we're not only talking about the pattern, it's usually being used as a way of trying to galvanise people to become part of a program, and that's often where the problems start to occur, because programs will always fracture, groups will always fracture. It doesn't matter what common ideological commitments you have, at some point you'll start to see the fray of those commitments. If we think now, I'd mentioned the working class support base, unskilled working class support base, and that's not the only support base, but that in a sense is a massive energy. And it's interesting because it's a massive energy of people that aren't naturally inclined to want to participate in political life. They tend to be reactive rather than proactive, and that is they just want things to be left alone. And then what happens is they see their world being devoured, their role in the world, what they value about the world, the reason they want to be in the world, the hopes that they have. They see this as being eroded. The groups doing this erosion, what's very interesting about that is how ferocious some of the animosities within that group are, but they are all ameliorated. And I think you can see this very clearly in the election of Joe Biden, for example, in the United States. I mean, who wanted Joe Biden, seriously? Who liked him? Don't tell me. And you go, yeah, he's not Trump. That's why people voted, whatever. But there's no way you can tell me that people in the radical Marxist, socialist, identity politics people at the university, that they really like Joe Biden and what he stands for. I think they think he's probably a crook. You know, there's all sorts of stuff out there that he works with the capitalist classes who they hate. And yet, nevertheless, there is an alignment of interests, because within their respective positions, each one comes out wanting something, and then they find some kind of fit, some common pattern. And so if that means working in a corporation, even though you talk how much you hate capitalism, but you need a job, you'll go and work for that corporation, and then you hope to change that corporation by changing the political culture. And over time, through the institutional structures we have, the reproduction of the society, the reproduction of the classes, class, remember, being just where you are in the line of division of labour, and then the alliances, we start to see these people doing things for very different reasons that all look like they're the same things. For example, let's say corporations now in their HR offices taking a stand on all sorts of social issues, whether it's Black Lives Matter or flying the gay flag, for example, pride flags and all of this. You know, what would that have to do with that business? And on the surface, you'd say, oh, not much really, but it actually does attract advertisers. It does set up a certain framework of personnel recruitment. But it also is a way of branding. And the problem is, of course, but what about the people that hate this brand? What about those branding? Well, that then encourages those who create the narratives or monitor the narrative, create and monitor the narratives that have fed into the human resources institution, now become part of company policy, or if it's in a public institution like a university or school, fed into the curricula, fed into the various activities, universities flying a gay parade, a gay flag, for example, because they want inclusivity, equity, all of these terms. Nevertheless, what they do is galvanise this very disparate groups of people. And then the difficult people are those that don't believe them. They don't accept this. So then they've got to find a way to double down on this in the easiest way, the most common way, that is also because of the kind of political culture that's been set up, happening ever since the American Revolution, the French Revolution, with all this rights talk, is to talk about rights and then talk about those that violate rights. And now we're back in the oppressor emancipatory dyad, and anyone that goes along with this is an oppressor. And one way you can do that is say, well, whites were here and blacks were oppressed, but of course you've got all these white people in the university teaching this, even though they are identical to the people that they are blaming for the problem. How is that possible? Well, one of the things that happens with ideology is the idea is all important. It's the exact opposite of what Marx said. And in fact, that doesn't surprise me, because what I said before was that Marx wasn't who he said he was. His thought did indeed come from his social being, but not the social being of being a worker. It came from a social being position of someone who spends their day thinking about, with the information they've got, which he trusts, but it's very limited information. It's because all of us have limited information, but it's limited also by the fact that he is unaware of what gestures, what intellectual movements he's making based upon rhetorical dexterity or rhetorical ability, based upon his understanding of how the economy works. It all comes down to, remember the very first lecture I spoke about character, but another way I can say this is people. It all comes down to people. So although you're a member of a group, the kind of person you are is also going to play a role. And again, when I talk about character, a person, but also characteristics, in the ancient world, it was not uncommon for people to write books about character. Aristotle would talk about it. I'm pretty sure there's another philosopher who writes about character then in more modern times. I'm thinking the 18th century, little work on character. This was taken very seriously. That's kind of vanished. We don't deal with that anymore because ideas have trumped character in the way that we speak about the world. This is a problem. This is the problem because we're slicing off a component of the real that would be very helpful, that's very important to understand it. And of course we supplement that by doing biographies of characters that have made an important role in history. But again, that's very interesting because most of the people that write the biographies, not always, but they often have fallen in love with the person they're writing on. Some may really dislike them and they come at it from that angle as well. But quite often, my experience was that people that wrote on Marx or Nietzsche or Freud, they tended to love Marx or Nietzsche or Freud or whoever. So the match-up between character and ideas is also the group character. That's the class, the group character. So all of these things play a role. And what we see is the incredible antagonisms that exist between people wanting to get their way. It's just like someone really has a strong will within a small group and they want to override everyone. You can see that's a source of discontentment. And then if you've got a different groups being allied with each other, that group really wants X, and the other group it's partnering with will have to yield something to so that they can get that. And a lot of what we're seeing at the moment, socially and politically, is exactly that. So a certain commitment to an ideational set of commitments, which have bound people that are also our stakeholders, and that's the term the World Economic Forum uses, and other groups use it. It's become a very common term. That people talk about stakeholders. So if we have an institution, there are stakeholders in the institution. There are stakeholders in a narrative. There are stakeholders in society, and what is very interesting is, what does that mean exactly, that you're a stakeholder? Why have we taken a term that really comes out of management theory and we would use it in a constant commercial context? How has that just simply been transposed into seeing the world at large? And one aspect of this, and this is something like Whitney Webb has talked about this, and I totally agree with her, and philosophically this was already being grasped by Martin Heidegger, who, he certainly made some terrible political choices, and I've written on Heidegger and I've said some quite critical things about Heidegger, but he was absolutely right that the biggest planetary danger was the attempt to make everything calculable. So everything will become economically calculable. The water, the air that we breathe, everything will be given a cost. And this requires then a dependency upon those doing the costing. And it also then requires a dependency upon, an economic requirement of those that do the policing as well as the calculating, of those that do the lawmaking. And you start to see that a whole amalgam of interests all bind together around the information, but it's that interest then that pushes forward the need for that information. I can't remember if I said this. Michel Foucault was very right about the idea that the professional classes create the object which requires their further economic investment in them as a group. So this is it's vested interest, it's self-interest. They are stakeholders in a certain narrative, stakeholders in things being seen a certain way, and we can see the major ones doing it are the professional classes. And that spans classes from being a school teacher or kindergarten teacher who may, for political reasons, be interested in the way children are being, gender is working, and sexuality, the sexualization of youth in a certain way, through the books that they read. Again, the more so-called conservative, more traditionalist people really don't like the fact that their children are being exposed to books that are highly sexualized. Now, this is presented by LGBTQ people as, well, that's just prejudice. But not really, because they wouldn't want them about heterosexual stuff either, most of these parents. And this is, again, another source of great anger. And each one has a vested interest in their associations in the world. The big question is, okay, everyone's locked into their interests and what they want, but what is likely to be the outcome of what we want? And this then also requires us thinking about information and the quality of information, but also about human capacity and the characteristics of human capacity, the fact that we are proud, we are ambitious, or many of us are proud, many of us are ambitious, and the gaps in our knowing, the folly in our being, in our character, that these are tended to be left out of the picture. So if I have, I want to be a manager of something, I don't look at myself in the mirror and go, well, really, I'm a bit of a dummy. I wouldn't be able to manage anything. So it's just my ambition driving that. I mean, whoever does that, what you see is I can go, I learned to be a manager, I've learnt this, throw a task at me, I'll do it. No matter what a disaster I make. Of course, that requires others recruiting you. So there's a certain act of recognition, recruitment. You come into the team, and how do you come into the team? Well, you've learned the information that person is looking for. You give them back that information. It's a bubble. Everyone is sharing this communal act of solidarity as they're taking the firm, the enterprise, the department, whatever group, professional entity it may be, whether it's corporate, whether it's state. It's all very similar process, and very much then directed to what are the major interests, what are the major fortunes, what are the major dictates, and that there is a dictate level, a dictatorial level, is why getting hold of the legislators is extremely important. Now, if we look at this at a global level, because this is where it's being played out, the way in which information has become not only generated, but who decides which information is going to be all important. Who decides which information is going to be disruptive of the interest? This starts to play a very big part in things. Now, Again, so I figure Michel Foucault here, one of the ironies I've always found about the post-structuralists is how they saw certain processes of domination and control and identified them and articulated them, but their followers have used identically the same things, it's just now it's done for a different purpose. So, since Michel Foucault is the most, or he was a couple of years ago, the most cited person within the academy, but given that he wrote books criticising the way in which institutions normalise and therefore create these oppressive structures for those people who are on the margins of society and everything. Now we're supposed to believe that the same processes of normalisation of what he calls discursive regime are all for the good, because somehow it is the marginalised that have got in there. And of course there are certain policies, there are certain recruitment policies saying, or affirmative action programs, or just we want someone who's not a white male, or we want someone who is trans in the department, give us a good look. All of these features don't really change anything in the fact that what you're doing is using an institution to try and not only consolidate, but give a certain kind of narrative, certain kind of authority, and you need to monitor and protect that narrative, and you recruit people who share that narrative. You favour this group because they speak this way, and and a lot of things it doesn't even matter if there's any outcome. I mean, I walk around my suburb, I see people with climate action now, and I think, well, what's the difference between them and me in what we actually do with energy, except they believe that if they do not do something, and the question is, what actually are you doing? Are you living off grid? If you're not living off grid, if you're running a big house, you've got electricity in a pretty cold place for part of the year, or a hot place where you're using air conditioning. It's just talk. What you're saying you want is you want someone to change the world in a way. It's like that, that young girl, Gwyneth Thunberg, stamping her feet and pulling faces because the world's not the way she wants it, and she's understood everything, so she thinks, about how we could fix up the planet. And of course, not realising that, well, if you want to know what the world would look like with that, without our energy supplies and forces, well, go back a couple of hundred years and you can see that the amount of impoverishment was substantially higher, and the conflict wasn't any less. So there'd be a lot of conflict but in a sense it doesn't matter, because what matters is as long as you say the right thing, then you are well informed. And then somewhere you agree, or somehow you agree on a policy, and whether the policy is really effective or not, once you've all agreed, it's very difficult for you to dig your way out of that. That's what an ideology does. It seals off. It seals the associations. It stops them from being open. Now, and people believe they're well informed, and I just want to say here, we're all misinformed. So the idea that we can trust people who will be so all-knowing that they can identify misinformation, this is so dangerous, and it's why there are one group of people who see where we're going with the world as absolutely tyrannical, and they are seen as a danger to those people who are wanting to coordinate and centralise information flow, because that's the situation we're in now. We're in a situation now where there is an attempt to have, and of course it's mad. It's mad for geopolitical reasons, and it's mad because of the regions you've got, but the stakeholders are so firmly convinced that they're right, and they're having all these conferences and meetings and talks, and they look around, they see more and more people like them, the most powerful people in the world, all getting on board with this. Well, they got the fact that most of the rest of the world, in terms of pure numbers, are not the slightest bit interested in the kind of world they're wanting to make. And that's a serious problem for them. What are they going to do about that? And now that it's geopolitically fractured, if you could have brought on board the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians, but they're all drifting away from this. And in part it's because in order for this globalist future to happen, in part it had to destroy the family. It wanted to destroy the family. That's a big problem. That's a big problem for more traditional societies. And the way that they've done it through the sexualization of identity, a big problem for conservative peoples. Whether you like it or not, it's a serious problem. So what has happened now with the globalist West is it focuses all its attempts to control information within the Western sphere, and it increasingly has come to rely upon those that somehow are seen to have the authority to be able to check which information is true, the so-called fact checkers. But when you look into who's doing it, and again, there's any number of people that can tell you this, but you look at the who founded Snoops, for example, or any of the other fact-checking organisations, or who's involved in Politico, and you start looking at their background, they're not magical, smart, brilliant human beings finding other sources to do investigative work. Some facts that they will check will really be crap facts, and they're rightly checked. Others they will twist and turn around. I'll give you, I read recently, about 3 weeks ago, or maybe a bit longer, someone, it might have been for Vanity Fair, but I can't remember the magazine, but it was someone writing to say what to say about Hunter Biden's laptop, because this was such a big issue, of course, the fact that the information on the laptop, well, first of all, it was denied outright. So it was denied, its existence was said to be a fabrication by Russian meddling. I mean, just, and senior people, senior military people, and other senior people came out and said that they had no proof, but they were doing fact-checking. And the story was being suppressed, and then the stuff that's happening with Twitter once Elon Musk took over, the investigation of how the information is controlled, the way in which the state has tried to use tech, and had not only tried to, has successfully used the tech to help drive certain policies. COVID responses was a very typical example of that. Russia is another typical example of that. I mean, in that case, the United States has not declared war against Russia. The EU is not, or various nations. They speak as if they had, and they haven't. And that's very interesting, because that's exactly the world that we're in. It does something with one hand and then pretend it's not doing it with the other hand. And of course, this leads to a complete breakdown of trust by those that don't see their place in the world in any way, shape or form being improved by the people that have the authority to be the ideas brokers, the makers and shakers. And that with social media, that enables decentralization, which so proliferated, and of course that became a major problem. Because with that proliferation, that enabled the kind of populism that went directly against this greater centralization, coordination, way of trying to... The word I want to use is alignment, and the German for that is Gleichschaltung. And it was a common term during the Nazi period. And that's because the Nazis wanted to align all information, economic activity, in exactly the same way, except obviously there's some things are different, but in terms of the structural way in which the larger group would work with business and the state and information control and control even of one's desires and thoughts, and the leadership principle, which is part of the globalist nomenclature today, the global, I think I've mentioned this before, the young global leaders, for example. If you have a global leader, then you need a global lead. And if you've got the global lead, what that means is, here are people we want to do what we tell them to do. And we don't want those people wanting things that are against our interests. And what we said is, you've got an alignment of very diverse interests. The radical trans kid at a university doesn't think that they're on the same planet as, or have the same interests as Bill Gates or the people carrying out COVID, it seems to be. And yet, of course, trans and surgery that supports Big Pharma, and Big Pharma with COVID and trying to find ways to make the state always work for interests. Happy to pay out money to for lawsuits and everything, because that's just part of the business deal. But if we can avoid that, which we have when we get the state to support and sanction everything we're doing, and we work with them, so you can see, well, there's degrees of separation. The fact that you don't think it doesn't mean it's not happening. But they're the kind of things that fact checkers aren't interested in. And that is the kind of thing that various people who do podcasts are very interested, and they get huge number of listeners. And the people doing this, and I am one, are people who are utterly dissatisfied with the kind of abstractions that are dominating, because that is what is happening, dominating so-called information. Now, the people who are called conspiracy theorists, I'm not saying all, because some, there's mad people everywhere, I'm sure. But people I think are very clever and who are aware of different interests will track and trace personal encounters involvement. Good. Take another example. The example of the so-called Russiagate narrative. Now, all sorts of people out there believe that Donald Trump won the 2016 election because of Russian meddling in the election. And if you ask what was the meddling exactly, you'll see, well, the story kept shifting. Initially, they were supposed to have actually got into the electronic ballots, now, which is a whole other question about electronic machines and the problems that they cause. And if people really wanted to secure democracy, they would not have these machines. They're source of too much contention. You've seen the reaction that took place, I don't know, a month or two back in Brazil with those elections, and why, if anyone bothers to look, they'll see there's serious concerns being expressed about this kind of machinization, or mechanization, I should say, of the electoral process. It's a very, and again, I know that there's arguments on the other side saying, yes, but if you don't do that, then people are being disenfranchised. Well, at some point you have to ask, how are you able to best have trust? And that's what's broken in the West. It's completely broken. And having things like fact checkers does not, no one who's open-minded takes much fact checking seriously, because they know that the fact checked is just twisted. And I started off saying that example in Vanity Fair with the Hunter Biden laptop, and the young, I think it was a young woman writing this piece, was basically saying, well, you say to your Auntie Bill and Uncle Jack, because she presented anyone who believed that there were serious issues to do with the Hunter Biden laptop and the information it had about the various business interests that his father was involved in, and and the other salacious sexual material, any of those concerns that they had were that this affected the outcome of the election, which it did, or any concerns they might have had, because when this story broke, it was clearly the case now, that this was actually something that was being protected by the state, intelligence agencies in the state, and media outlets. The coalition here, anyone who had these concerns was being treated as a fool, like you Uncle Bill or Auntie Mary, and it told you what to say to them. It was an astonishing piece in which it was half-truths, and I don't want to care about even going into the details, but anyone who knew the story of the laptop with any degree of seriousness, who had looked into it, just knew this was just rubbish. And it was an attempt to make anyone who believed this story, like your old auntie and uncle, or your grandma, they're silly. At best, they're silly, because you're in New York or Los Angeles and you work for this big company and you all have these conversations. You don't need the facts. And in fact, you're not interested in the facts. Let's be honest here. What you're interested in, and this is something that's been fascinating with how the media has transformed, even though there's to some extent it was always like this, but it's got increasingly more obviously not only partisan, but it's increasingly its job has become to shut down information, to not spread information, and to denounce those that spread information. And it's far worse than what happened, say, in the McCarthy years. Because if one recalls, in the McCarthy years, in the 1940s in the United States, there were a lot of left-wing people in the academy, in the entertainment business, and they were basically being attacked by a state operative which increasingly found that it didn't have that much support for it. That's very different to now, because what we have now is the state operatives and certain political parties, or indeed one of the issues that was very interesting with Trump was it was a revolution within the Republican Party. So a very big chunk of one party and almost the entirety of the other party, with one or two exceptions, had shared a set of interests with the world's wealthiest people, so 19 out of the 20 wealthiest states electoral areas in the United States voted for Obama. That tells you something. This is in Christopher Colwell's book, but it's elsewhere. You can this tells you a lot. It only doesn't tell you something if you don't care about it, or if you just ignore it. So you can ignore it or you suppress it. And of course, if you set the agenda of narrative formation or narrative crafting and then the monitoring, you decide which facts should be checked. Not all facts are checked. Which ones were checked? How is it possible that when the hoax about Russia was so absolutely nothing, just a lie, and the consequences have been so absolutely disastrous in all sorts of ways, and it had a lot to do with the fact that half the population in the United States didn't believe the results of the election in 2020, just as in 2016, a sizable portion of the population, for the Democrats, didn't believe the result because they said it was this. Well, if you're positioned somewhere else outside the United States, this division is fantastic. If Xi Jinping in China must be absolutely delighted about this. But so are the globalists, because they want to get rid of the nation state as well. So there you have, an alliance that's not even necessarily a conscious alliance. It doesn't perhaps even involve any interaction for a common goal, which would be the destruction of the United States of America, which for lots of other people that would be a terrible thing, because it was one of the world's leading democracies. With all its flaws, it nevertheless has been an important player in pushing the democratic program. And then when it's and now when it comes to it, we're watching it dissolve, and it's being dissolved in all sorts of ways, like in Europe you have hate speech legislation. In the United States you've got freedom of speech as a constitutional principle, but that is being eroded because you can be sacked for saying something that you believe. If you can be sacked, de facto it's already gone. Freedom of speech no longer means anything. There's all sorts of ways in which we see this censorship play out. I started saying before, it did seem for a while that social media platform was opening up ways of communication, information flows between groups who usually kept in the dark, didn't say much, or kept quiet, didn't say much. And they became more and more politicised as by way of reaction. And then that became a major problem, as they could be seen. And that's when we started to see the... first of all, it was just deplatforming, just taking off. And that had already been happening in the universities. So again, just to not lose focus is information, misinformation. The ones who have their positions on any topic that seems to have been approved academically or some kind of authority, this is seen as the truth. And anyone who deviates from that is a danger. They're not only a danger because they're not telling the truth, they're a danger because they're questioning your authority to be an arbiter of what constitutes truth. So then it becomes very personal. It becomes an economic incentive to not allow this. Even if you don't think that's your major priority, that's an aspect of why one would do what one is doing, that is, shut people down. Don't listen to them. They will disturb the classroom if they come in here and they think X, but everyone else in the classroom thinks Y, because you've managed to propagate that. And then you have social media, where an explosion of voices, explosion of conspiracy theories, working from those who are completely mad to those who are really smart and investigative reporters of the sort that hardly exists in the mainstream media anymore. And people are listening to them. And this is a problem. So immediately I'll tell you one example that springs to mind is a guy called Brayton Stryker, New York liberal gay guy, got sick of, I may have used this example before, but for me it's one of those very telling examples. He created something called the hashtag walkaway movement. And the hashtag walkaway movement was really about a disaffection that came from being told what to think. That's really what drove it. And it was basically people who had walked away from the Democrat Party, and Stryker set this up, and others, hundreds and hundreds of people joined this movement and put online this stuff. And I watched a lot of them. And what struck me about them was the overwhelming unifying point for all of these people who said they had... some hadn't voted Trump in the 2016 election. I don't even think Stryker had. I think he came to his position after that. But there were a number who hadn't. Some had. And some that had, quite a few of those that I saw, had been Bernie Sanders supporters. So it was a very interesting journey. But at each one of them, the point was they wanted to think for themselves. And now with all the social media around, there's greater opportunities, there's more information out there. So you had words like rabbit hole and red pill coming into the vocabulary, the cathedral, coming into the vocabulary as people became increasingly drawn away from mainstream media, and the mainstream media has hated this. The state has hated this. And ultimately, big tech corporations who have been in all manner of ways have been beneficiaries of the state, then came to serve the state. So they now do the censorship. Well, this is, again, I say it came out of the Twitter files. It's obvious. Anyone who has been digging around, who's gone down rabbit holes, will know that this has been happening for a long time. And increasingly, the huge amount of information out there, and the point, I think, in which it became a symbolic line of no return was the so-called insurrection of January 6th. Again, there'll be some people who think that was a genuine insurrection, and others will say, how can it be an insurrection? It was a gaggle of people. They weren't armed. One person was shot, and that was a supporter of Trump who had broken in. There were Antifa people seen pretending to be Trump supporters breaking in. The names and that had been given. There was another lady who died. There was a cop died, but that was a couple of days afterwards, and that was presented, and people still treat it as if he died from that, which is just not true. So, again, fact checks. Where are these when you need them? So the insurrection, and in the academy, I just see it all the time. Everyone in the academy just thinks, oh, it was an insurrection. They use the word insurrection in a very different way to what I do. And I think, how is that actually different to when there was an attempt to storm the Supreme Court, when, Kavanaugh was being voted in or being nominated and had to, win the vote to get that position as Supreme Court judge. So as well, depends what the purpose is. The other day, a black guy got killed by 5 other black cops. There was no... the New York Times and 1 or 2 other things came out still saying it was a white supremacy issue. It's just... But this is what ideology does. It just rots your brain. And it's the difference between positionality giving you perspective and association to this all congealing into a dogma where no other information will get through. Because there is a natural tendency, like I said, for if you like, ideology, if you want to use that term, but then it becomes something else when it becomes a doctrine. That's very different. With getting back for a moment with the social media issue, I just wanted to say the first person was Alex Jones that was banned from this. And Alex Jones had said some foolish things about the Sandy Hook massacre, for which he apologised for. One might say he wasn't sincere because he was under legal pressure or whatever, I don't care. But the point I make is that was done, and it was seen as justifiable because he was so out there. And the question is, well, is a society that doesn't allow for genuine mistakes plausible? Is it plausible even? What kind of plausibility? We all err. And in which case, I would say, oh no, Alex Jones, he was deliberate and he did this. Okay, well, here's another question. Is there going to be more solidarity in a society where people feel free to think independently and arrive at the conclusions that they have on the basis of the information they have? Or is it going to be a more concordant society if everyone is in their place and those people that are in charge of certain areas of information flow, technocrats, must decide what is real information and what is false? And we have gone so far down that path now, it is impossible to see us breaking free of that without some social explosion. I say this not because I want that, but because I see that the interests are so strong in narrative protection, in stakeholding interests, in economic viability of their own positions. If I've spent my life since university working in institutions to scout out racism, the last thing I want is for there not to be racism considered a serious issue anymore. I have a stake in that being ongoing. And of course this is the problem with the kind of professionality and technocracy bonding with these other greater economic interests and political interests, that is the interests of the state, and those that work in the state, in the administrative apparatuses of the state, the so-called deep state. Again, when social media people had been drawing attention to the misbehaviour of deep state operatives, using that term, the same people that 30 or 40 years ago would have been very on board, now I'm thinking of university people, very on board with any expose of the CIA or the FBI and their misbehaviour, had now become voices to silence anyone speaking out against this. This is incredible, and it's the way in which this coalition of interests operate, in which people no longer can see what they're doing, and that's what ideology is. And it's done on the basis of, to take from last week what I was talking about, the truth and its aspects, it's done on the basis of ignoring, denying the existence of, persecuting people that identify certain aspects of a problem as seriously important, that need to be spoken about, even if people get it wrong, even if large numbers of people get it wrong. Because the attempt to prevent this is far worse than the disease, and that is the problem that I think that we're finding ourselves in, as we have, I used this term very early in these lecture series, have we had an increasingly ideocratic, so the ideas matter, kind of society. And those ideas, though, are then galvanized within certain institutions and certain professionals within those institutions, and then how then they can be incorporated within larger aspirational aims and purposes of very, very wealthy people. It's no accident that very, very wealthy people have, and this has been the case, by the way, the works of Anthony Sutton are worth mentioning here. The way in which very wealthy people supported the Bolsheviks. So the very wealthy really don't care about a particular ideology in terms of state or corporations, because they have all their wealth, and they know that corporately they can offer certain things that will make them money, and politically they can offer certain things to buy politicians. So the conflict over which information is to be authorized and how that information is to be used, as opposed to those that want to be able to think independently, access as much information as they can, be free to make mistakes. That's very much part of the great problem that we find ourselves in today, or the circumstance we find ourselves in today. And it's not one which there's an easy answer to, but it is one in which, if you want to make a difference, you will insist upon thinking independently and speaking out against the suppression of free speech, because the suppression of free speech is really the suppression of your ability to learn. And unless we learn, we cannot hold a modern society together. It will fall apart. Thank you.